So Laura, I can hear you perfectly. And so we're officially launching our fourth CT LILL today in March. And we're kicking off a beautiful spring day with Laura Terrill coming to us from Indianapolis. So thank you for being with us today, Laura. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, so today's topic is an exciting one, and we'll take a look at this agenda here. As you can see, we're going to be exploring the core practice of teaching grammar as a concept and using it in context. So we're going to look at an article from Ali Moeller to understand the various approaches to grammar instruction and how to select one over the other. So I welcome all of you from the states who are joining us, and I am the CT LILL coordinator for CT Colt, and my name is Leah Grenier Kennedy. So thank you all for doing the meeting today, but also for taking the time to activate our learning by reading the article and jotting down some questions and thoughts for Laura. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Laura and let her lead us through this. So Laura, are you ready for me to switch the screen over to you? Okay, sounds great. All right.
Let's hope it works the way it worked in practice, right?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on. Do it one more time.
Okay. And as all of you are watching, please feel free to use the chat box, and I'll try to keep an eye on it.
Leah,
Amanda,
you have to send that message once more.
once more. Okay, let's see.
Mhm.
Let's see here. For some reason, you're not coming up. Everybody else is.
Naturally.
Which is, okay, let's try this again.
Okay, let's see what happened.
So I'm going to show my screen. Let's try this again. Here we go. All right, the only other L's are Lisa and Lucas. So if we can't get Laura, one of you two have to step up. So hopefully
Okay,
you guys are ready.
It worked.
All right, you're off the hook, Lucas.
It went through that time.
Perfect.
Okay, so are you seeing my screen now?
Yep.
Okay. So let me go to full screen on the slides, which will take you off. Everybody bear with me. It worked? Everybody can see my screen?
It's perfect.
Okay, so thank you everyone for chiming in on this topic. I joked with Leah, this is the topic I usually save if I'm doing an all-day workshop, for either right after lunch to wake everybody up or right at the end of the day, so everybody gets really passionate about the topic, because I do think that this is the topic that causes a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos. But I also want to be quick to say that I am not an expert on this topic. So I said I would do this in the light of a good discussion with colleagues. I put these two questions out because I really do think that what we're really saying is that there is no one right answer. And I hope that came through in the article. I appreciated the comment from someone that said, well, if I gave this to my teachers, wouldn't they use the research to support their current thinking, their current paradigm? But I really believe that the article gave a balance for both. But then I do have to say that if you look further into any of those studies, it's really important that you know that many of them were done in universities with older students than it seems that some of us have the background with or are currently working with. And I think the thing that would make most teachers happy if we just called it conventions and made it the 6C and let teachers do exactly what they wanted to do with grammar in their own classrooms. But I think there's enough research out there that we really do have to honor what we know that is going on with our English colleagues in the language arts classroom. And they are having this conversation about conventions and the role that conventions play in the language classroom. And Ruth Cullum, who wrote 6+1 Traits of Writing, makes conventions one of the 6 traits, but she's very careful to say and to explain the research that backs the contention that in a classroom that focuses too much on accuracy, then everything else is lost, and students will stop being risk takers. They will no longer create those interesting texts. And so I think we have to know that there's a reason that learners are no longer coming to us knowing the parts of speech or what this is or what that is, and that our first fallback was that we should teach them their English grammar, only to realize that very few people know the parts of speech in the real world and still manage to speak and write in very intellectual ways in their daily lives and careers. So it's a balance and a perspective that we have to bring to our classroom. We'll look at approaches a little bit, but I like what she says about this. We're somewhere between this notion that it should be correct and everything has to be polished and perfect, that when they make a mistake, it's a bad mistake and that it's an indication of failure, to the opposite paradigm that will cause them to be risk takers and allow us to look at a paper that has mistakes in it, the way a coach looks at game day when the team didn't win, and say what caused us to not play as well as we could, and what will we do in practice next week to address these mistakes so that we do better in the future, and so that mistakes become an opportunity to really focus in and work on the problems that are evidenced in a sample of writing or speech. So she has the quote there that the best way to teach grammar is by using the text that students create. So monitoring them, allowing them to make mistakes and allowing them to learn from their mistakes. And then I wanted to bring in this quote by Bill Van Patten because I think that he, of all of the recent articles that I've read in The Language Educator, nailed it in this one quote, and that is, we have to remember that we speak to communicate and we don't speak to practice something. And so that we've put too much of pedagogy on the speaking we do is to enforce or practice a grammar construct. And so I always think when I'm in this mindset that of all those compositions that I assigned and graded that were topic-based, it would be like, if you had $1 million, what would you do? And all that really was a construct for practicing the conditional. They knew they'd never have that much money, and I didn't really care what they would do. I just wanted to see if they could nail the verb forms. And we did it with summer vacation, what did you do? And to me, that's where communication has become subservient to grammar or to a vocabulary set. And I think that's why the paradigm moves from the two extremes of explicit, implicit to the middle. And how are we going to bring people to our learners into that spot where they're both learning and using? And I think if somebody were to read that article and they were to go to the extreme of saying that, well, then it's okay to teach. I saw a comment in the notes, well, they're older learners, so they do need the rules. Yes, we know that the older learner can be assisted by hearing the rule, but it doesn't make it okay to practice the rules. So I gave you some examples of just ones that come to mind of things that I did, and I kind of feel badly about them now. But make the following sentences negative. Nobody's ever walked up to you and asked you to do that, or rewrite this sentence with a direct object pronoun. So it's moving away from the artificial to try to get at accuracy. It's also, someone had the concept of a non-linear approach to grammar. Our textbooks have given us a linear approach to grammar, and I just screenshot a couple of scope and sequence that I had on my computer, but can you even begin to imagine teaching the preteritive, stem changing verbs, direct object pronouns, comparisons, and superlatives all within 14 pages? That was new language concepts. Or even the other one, which is not quite as ambitious, but the linear approach to grammar that was given to us, we didn't always question or even think about why. Because if we had, we would have said intellectually, there's no common sense reason for teaching direct and indirect object pronouns before we would teach the past tense. The past tense is a far more useful construct. A lot of level 1 books do the direct and indirect object pronouns early and hold past tense for maybe even year 2. And there's just a lot of things like that where we teach the commands in all the modes where I took off if they didn't drop that S in French. And then only to realize much later when I was thinking better about a lot of these things that commands are oral and not written, so what difference did it make? Because they weren't really getting ready to write dialogue for textbooks. I always use Chantal Thompson's tree to remind teachers and myself of what proficiency is and where we want to put our initial efforts. And it was the comments that a couple of you made about how young learners do not need any rules to learn language. And that's because a young learner in first language is focusing on what can they do with language and how many new words and topics are they acquiring. And we need to remember that that's where we want to place our emphasis also in creating learners who are capable of functioning in a lot of situations, increasing, as the branches suggest, from the words, the memorized sentences, into sentences and strings of sentences and creating with sentences, and finally into a paragraph. And what's missing from this tree are the leaves. And depending on where you are in the country, we're coming out of winter. And a lot of the trees out there right now don't have any leaves at all. But because they had a strong trunk and a good root foundation, they survived the winter storms. And now the leaves are going to blossom out, and it's going to make the language pretty. It's going to create that accurate speaker of a language. But if you don't have the trunk and the roots, and you're not a risk taker, you probably will avoid using language. So some of you probably know that I had the opportunity to go to Puerto Rico and put this into practice because I had a good deal of Spanish language and a lot of receptive skills and an ability to string words together, but no ability to put the right ending on the verbs. I only knew the infinitives, and I could not for the life of me remember what the preterite or imperfect was. I could even metacognitively analyze it and know which one I needed, but it was useless to me. And it didn't matter. As long as my message was clear, no one really challenged me on those leaves. Obviously, I felt guilty, and I'm not suggesting that we avoid that last category, but I think it's keeping everything in a balance that's critically important with grammar. Leah and I talked about this. I'm going to put in this slide on the AP just in case there are some listeners that are not familiar with the new format of the AP. And the reason I'm doing this is I often get asked about preparing students for the AP. We have to prepare students for the AP. Well, the AP has drastically changed. And 2006, I think, was the first revision year for Spanish, but 50% of the exam now is the interpretive mode, listening to authentic text. AP says the other 50% is productive and interpersonal and presentational. Actually, there's a good deal of interpretive in that 50%. So, but what's missing from what they ask learners to do now is all discrete point grammar and vocabulary. There are no fill in the blanks. The final task is this presentational writing. And so if you're taking this into departments to talk about, I would take this task in and really ask if this is what they have to be able to do. Read a text, listen to a text on the same topic, possibly with 2 different points of view, and look at a graphic like in USA Today with some content related to the topic. Think for a while and then write at least 200 words, interjecting their opinions but calling on all 3 sources to defend their opinions. Go. What does a learner need to be successful in that? And then pull the AP rubric that says you can get a 5 as long as you have no patterns of errors in terms of grammar. So it's a reality check for what it is we want our learners to do. And there's a similar activity in speaking where they'll be asked to draw on what they've learned in their classes, think for a bit, and then they have 2 minutes to record their spoken presentation on that topic. They have to draw on their own lives with evidence from the target language cultures to support, compare, and contrast. An ability to conjugate or to do the subjunctive is nice, but it's not going to create the type of speaker who can necessarily pull this off. This requires a different level of sophistication. And so what's happening now, and for those of you that want an excellent module on grammar, go to the link at the bottom, the open source at the University of Texas on the grammar module. Their methods class online has a lot of good information. But really what's happened in the profession, I think, is that we realized that, especially if you've been doing this for a while, that old grammar translation just drove everybody out of the classroom. There's a few of us out there that learn that way, so we think it works. But the reality is I went to French after studying all through junior high, high school, and college to my junior year. And when I got there, that's when I learned to speak French. So even though I was good on the rules, it didn't really work. And then the opposite was when I taught ALM, and it was sort of like by osmosis. Let's just read all these dialogues over and over again, and you will acquire language. That would probably work if you were immersed in first language. I certainly see evidence of that with my 5-year-old grandson. He makes very few grammar mistakes. He actually caught one of mine the other day and corrected me, so that was a really nice moment of shock. So it's explaining to people that this is really where we're going with these terms. We're coming into a sense that we can bring this together. And I wanted to step back to what Greta shared last time, because I think that in her backward design, when she started talking about the can-do statements, the goals of the unit, the language functions, when Donna and I wrote Keys, we did an analysis of every textbook that we had in our houses over the years we had been teaching, and decided that there are main functions that drive language learning. If you go back to the tree analogy, those functions are the trunk, and we want to come back to them over and over and over again and spiral them up. And this is where a linear approach can really let us down, because I can remember teaching a French textbook, and the questions were all in Unit 7, and that's the only time they came up. And so if they didn't get them then, they weren't deliberately recycled in any meaningful way. And if you're really going to be good at that past tense narration, you're going to have to do past tense over and over and over again in order to build that capacity. So it's these functions that actually precede the goals of your unit, what you want learners to be able to do in the real world, that precede any conversation about where does grammar go. So it's really, tell me what you want me to do, and I'll tell you what grammar you should teach or work on in order to cause that to happen. Because in so doing, you're going to allow them to move, for this example of describing, from he's tall, he's short, up to describing a character in a novel with enough depth to make that character or that movie actor or actress come alive. And so what that means is we can't think of description and adjective agreement as a level 1 concept, because it has to come back in more and more specific ways in order to really build our grammar capacity. So what that does is it creates a prove to me that you need the grammar mindset. And when I'm working with teachers on unit design, this is basically what I say when they say, well, they have to have the, and you can just fill in the blank. Whatever grammar is near and dear to your heart or the heart of some teachers you work with, they're going to want to teach it when they've always taught it. So I would never say to anyone, you can't teach that grammar in this level, even if I firmly believe it. What I now say is, prove to me, sorry about that, prove to me that you need that grammar, that there is a function that requires that grammar. And in doing that, it becomes easy to think about grammar as a nonlinear, create a little check chart, that's what Donna and I sometimes do, to make sure that the grammar is being recycled in level 1, level 2, level 3 in meaningful ways. But you can see here, if you look at it, that there's grammar in this chapter. If you look at the one that says indicate how they and others go to school, they're going to need the verb to go. I go, you go, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that later. But I'm going to give you one to ponder. Some of you may have heard me say this one before. But direct and indirect object pronouns are often taught at a low level. Think really hard between now and when we start having conversation or you're writing your comments about a function that would require the use of a direct object pronoun. You have to come up with a statement where I will need to use a direct object pronoun in real life. And that's really the key. Do we need it now, time and point grammar, in order to meet the functional needs of language? And it's going to create a cycle for planning when to embed grammar in different courses and to make sure that it comes back. So let's look at some examples. If we use authentic text, we find that text that's near and dear to our hearts, and we really want to use it. We know we have found absolutely the right text. Before we do anything with grammar, we're going to work with that text in all 3 modes. So this slide is just to remind us that I want to read a poem, I want to use this song in class, I've got this nonfiction article that I want to read, but probably in that article, after we've talked about it and we've written about it, we've read it, we've processed it, we understand it, there may be a grammar construct in there that we want to call attention to. This is where grammar comes in. So what it is it's shifting the old paradigm, which was here's the new vocabulary, here's the new grammar. Often there were textbooks that even presented that as 2 separate components. And then I actually taught one where it went from vocabulary, grammar, and the 3rd section was called application. So one of the things we know is that application comes first. So we really want the learner to be immersed in doing it and making mistakes. I don't know why this keeps ringing. I keep hanging up on that. But sorry about that. So that's where it comes into what most of you have probably seen in the teacher's handbook, where Shrum and Eileen Glisson often presents on this. I know she shared some of this summer, is the PACE model. Now, I am not a purist when it comes to the PACE model because I don't believe that you can ever find exactly what you want, nor do you have the time. So let me give you a hybrid example of PACE that I think is more realistic to suggest to your teachers. I'm not faulting the pure model. I'm just being a realist. Oops, went the wrong way. So in the presentation, you have read, heard, and enjoyed this song. If there's any French teachers out there, Baby Lily is a parody of all of the top 10 hits, and she redoes the words so that they are classroom appropriate. So this was a breakup, and these are not the words of the original song, but these are the Baby Lily rendition of the song. So you can imagine that this angry woman did not eat all the chocolate or drink all the Coca-Cola. She was drinking other things, et cetera, et cetera. But you've acted this out. You understand this perfectly. And now you're ready to call attention to the grammar. And so what's happening is, what I like to tell teachers is you no longer get to give the grammar rules. Even in the article you read where it said that older learners need the rules, it didn't say the teacher provided them. It just said they need them. They might do better if they understood them. So you're looking at a lot of passé composé. It's been highlighted. You can give them the text. They can find their own examples. You're ignoring the irregulars. And it's time to co-construct the rule. So up to a certain point, you can do all of this in the target language. And then Eileen Glisson actually says this is one of the times when you can take some of that little bit of English, and if they have to do some of this in English at lower levels, it's an acceptable use of English because the students are going to be coming up with the grammar rule. So I don't know how many of you are French, but this is what you'd basically be doing. You would know that that was to eat. Yesterday I ate chocolate. I pulled my cat's tail. So you would know what the words meant because they'd be acted out or they'd be words I'd selected you knew. And what I would say to you is individually on your paper, write down the answer. No explanation, no rules, follow the pattern. Because basically, especially at lower levels, we want to work with high frequency, regular to the greatest extent possible. You do as many of them as it took to where you started to feel like they were building some confidence. You might do another one alone. And on the next one, when you're trying to say, I forgot my homework, you might say, do it first on your own and then compare it with your partner. And so they start to look and see how closely is my brain attending to the pattern. So when you ask them, well, what is the rule? If you're the publisher of a textbook, how would you explain the rule? Turn to your partner, talk it over. And they're going to come up with, and if you're looking at this as a non-Spanish French teacher, you're going to say you drop the R and you add an E with an accent. And plus use the auxiliary verb, which you would not know, but they'd say use AI, and you could pull out of them that AI comes from blah, blah, blah verb. But you're looking at a pattern in the brain, drop the R and add an accent, that no textbook ever states. And that's where rules can kind of confuse the brain, which is a basic pattern-seeking device. And aided and assisted, they will see the patterns. It will see the patterns on its own. So they write those rules. You help them to come to a correct understanding. Because they have explained the rule from their brain, they own the rule. If you're the one that keeps saying these rules, like you use the auxiliary verb avoir and you blah, 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 this makes no sense at all, especially to that younger learner who is not an abstract thinker yet. So if anyone's on that's under high school, give it up, because we know abstract thinking kicks in at puberty. And when you're starting to say things like the past participle agrees in gender and number with a preceding direct object, that's just gobbledygook to that brain. Finally, with that rule in mind, you ask them to extend it, which is basically to make application of it the way they would in the real world. So filling in the blanks. We all know if we've been teaching for a while, they can nail it. Turn around a day later and ask them to write some sentences, and they'll blow them, or they'll get the first two right, and then they'll flip back to infinitives. So extension is, how can I ask them to apply what they've just learned? So in class that day, it might be an exit slip, 3 things they did last night, homework, ask them to generate some more verbs and things they did. Next day, an image, they pretend they're the person in the image. What did they do? And the reason I said role play, they pretend they're the person, is the other habit we want to break is all 6 pronouns on the same day. Until they have I and you, the others are not going to be used in a meaningful way. So it's what was my function? My function is to ask and answer questions about what I did or what you did. So I need I and you. If it's to retell a story about a cat or a dog, then they need third person. So what is your function that you're really working on tells you what grammar you really need. So I'm going to play this, just a little bit of this video, and as you're watching it, because this is grammar based, I want you to try to think, whether you understand Spanish or not, French teachers exist in both languages, what grammar might you pull out of this beautiful little video? Hopefully it'll play. And I'm sure many of you have seen this.
Cada día miles de niños en el mundo van de camino a la escuela.
Oh, I'm sorry about the words.
Para algunos es un simple paseo, para otros significa atravesar desiertos, ríos, paisajes helados o barrios marcados por la guerra. A pesar de los obstáculos, estos niños quieren una educación. La pobreza, el género, los riesgos naturales o los conflictos no deberían interponerse en su camino. En Kibera, en el poblado de chabolas más grande del África Oriental, Elizabeth emprende cada día un peligroso camino de 1 hora hasta la escuela. En Libia, la pequeña Amal, de 11 años, camina entre casas bombardeadas durante su trayecto a la escuela. En Sertown, Brasil, Patricio de Oliveira, de 6 años, se sube cada mañana a lomos de su burro y hace 1 hora de camino a través del desierto para llegar a la escuela. Mientras que en México, Esmeralda y Patricia, de 9 y 10 años, cruzan valles, bosques y hasta alambradas de espino para llegar a la escuela, una caminata diaria de casi 4 horas.
So probably you picked it up, and if we had more time in dialogue, I'd be interested to hear what you say. But clearly, much of the video deals with going to school. When I first saw this video, I thought this is where I would teach the modes of transportation instead of in the city unit, because it's far more interesting than talking about how you get from point A to point B in a city. But you can see with the French, if we really worked on it and we talked about it, now I might start to do some work with the verb to go, or with the ER verb and they brave as they go to school, so that we can work on the patterns of instruction for the grammar to say how I and others go to school. So it's using that authentic text, taking the function of the unit and attaching the grammar to that gives us the best chance of embedding that grammar construct into their heads. Then if we go back to conventions and we say it's okay to make mistakes, if they miss the correct form of the verb aller, to go, we just have to make note of that as they're working, as they're talking, not recast it, not even necessarily deal with it that day, but plan another lesson or a revisiting of it in a new way so that we keep coming back to it and cycling it. And we can't think that just because we did it in first year, that it doesn't need to be revisited in subsequent years as their language becomes more sophisticated. We know, if we've been doing this a while, that even the simplest things are still missed at upper levels. So the PACE model and some of the other strategies I'm going to show you are trying to get our learners to go from it sounds right, which is the native speaker analysis of grammar. I don't know, it sounds right. I wish I was, I wish I were. Pretty soon they're both going to be correct, because in English they're both starting to sound right. And so that's how language changes. But what we're trying to say is, and we'll give you the here's why for our older learners, but we will do it in a way that allows you to figure out the why of the grammar. So it's moving from the old paradigm where you would create a writing assignment and then you would tell them what grammar to embed and what to use, and you can see a sample there, to now just define the task. Explain what has happened about this current event, comment on what is happening, predict what will happen, give your thoughts on what should happen. I'm asking for the same grammar, but I'm not telling you what grammar to use. Because the truth of the matter is if I have to give an assignment and tell you to use the preterite tense, I don't know if you know the grammar or not. I don't know if you'll use the preterite when it's up to you to choose the correct form of the verb. So let me just give you a few examples that I tend to share that seem to help people understand what it means to embed grammar in instruction and assessment. If you were to pick this as a writing structure fairly early in the year, personal details, physical traits, personality traits. This is something we ask students to do. You're embedding culture into it with the two pictures that you've chosen. You're getting a girl to write as if they're a boy. You're getting a boy to write as if they're a girl by role-playing and pretending they're in those pictures. So you're still going to find out how they're doing when it comes to adjective agreement. Here is a verb poem. That's what it's called. So give French teachers a chance to see it in the French for a minute, and then I'll switch it over to the English translation. But you have your j'ai voyagé, tu m'as écrit, mon ami est venu, nous avons visité, vous avez bien dîné, mes amis se sont amusés. And if you're picking up on the pattern, what you basically have is an I, you, he, she, we, you, they. It takes so much time to think about telling a story with the 6 subject pronouns and then using the grammar. Tell me the story. That's going to require you to use the preterite, the past tense. Because they're creating with language, they're going to make more mistakes. And we have to tolerate those mistakes in order to improve language. Actually, one thing that you should take comfort in knowing or reminding yourself is that when a student is moving from novice high to intermediate low, the number of mistakes goes up because they move from memorized language to creating with language. So I always tell teachers when they start making more mistakes, you should be patting yourself on the back because they're crossing that border, which is a really hard border to cross. So it's a good sign when you start to see inconsistency and mistakes, because now you're just like the coach. You got to have practice to improve and work them out. Here's another example. Art gives us a rich source of visual images in an easy, maybe almost too simplistic way to embed culture, but it is a nice way to do it, especially at the lower levels. So her name's Mona Lisa. She's 32 years old. She's not pretty, but she's not ugly either. She has long hair, not black, not blonde. And by having them describe a self-portrait, you're still working on adjective agreement. But it's a real thing that you're doing. And you can almost imagine a more sophisticated description when you're standing in the museum and looking at the painting. This is my favorite technique that I probably embedded into my own classrooms at least twice a week, beginning in level 1. And that would be any picture that related to the topic we were on so that some of the vocabulary was familiar. And they had to tell me a 3-sentence story, always in the lower levels in the first person, so that we weren't worried about all of the different forms. And what they would have to do is they would have to create their story about what did you do yesterday, what are you doing today, and what are you going to do tomorrow. And what this was an effort to do, and from my perspective it worked, is to let them see that different times exist, that they really are past, present, and future, because in first language we just select the correct tense without being able to identify it. So this way it might be something as simplistic as, yesterday I went to the rainforest, or yesterday I saw a waterfall, or yesterday I walked on a path, or I climbed the mountain. Today I am swimming in the pond, or I am hiking in the rainforest. And tomorrow I am going to visit a different place, or tomorrow I am going to look for animals and flowers. Anything that they wanted to say was acceptable, and as they would give me the sentence, I would write the correct the subject and then the correct form of the verb, so that they were just constantly seeing me changing the verbs, starting to call attention to this pattern of speech. And if, for those of you that are thinking actful, going to, so using aller plus the infinitive or ir a is future time frame. So they do not have to use will. So once they get to this point, they're starting on that critical pathway of controlling the 3 time frames without being told to use a particular time frame. Then the last one is that, a lot of what I just shared is writing, but Chantal Thompson says in speaking, we can prime the pump for grammar also. If we will do these conversations with the class in the target language. So this is an example that she shared at ACTFL, where you would work with your students, describe the situation to them. You're doing as much of this in the target language as you can. You might do a shorthand and just say on film, on weekend. And then you tell them exactly what they need to be able to do. You let them help you. If they want to add to that list of tasks, we could talk about the actors. We could talk about whether we liked it or not. We could, we can justify why we want this movie over that movie. You remind them of the functions they're going to embed, because those are the functions that you're working on. And you ask them to generate. So like if you're saying like, dislike, aimer, j'aime, je n'aime pas, you're helping them to see the correct pattern. You're writing it in French. Then you're also giving them some what vocabulary will you need? And you make a brief list of vocabulary in the target language, give them a chance to add anything, and then say, work with your partner. Because now you're scaffolding it, because we know that the interpersonal, when you're thinking on your feet, is the one that's most likely to need support, especially at the lower levels, or they're just going to, the need to deliver a message takes over and grammar is gone. So it's sort of a hybrid of how to work on grammar without sacrificing interpersonal and rehearsing it too much. So in the last minute or so, I want to talk about this notion of these discrete point skills. If I had $1 for every time I gave a quiz and they got it all right on Friday and couldn't remember any of it by Monday or Tuesday, I would be very rich. And so when I have teachers that I'm working with that are still very traditional, and I do think our profession has moved a lot, but if you work with and you're trying to persuade someone who feels like filling in the blanks is step one to doing some of what we just talked about, go ahead, challenge them, ask them to give that fill in the blank test on a Friday. Don't allow them to do any review before they pass out the test on that Friday. So it has to be a cold test, at least first thing when they walk in. They take that test, they get a grade. 48 hours later, so Monday, ask them to give it again with no warning. And whatever the grade is on Monday is the measure of learning. And we know from research the grade's going down no matter what. I mean, hardly anyone can retain. But I used to have new teachers in the district do that so that they could see how hard they were working to get students to memorize and fill in the blanks and how fragile that knowledge was. But so what you need to have a suggestion then. When you try to take something away, you want to give teachers something to hold on to. So this is what I've been recommending. And I was doing just a little bit of this my last year in the classroom. Vocabulary quizzes and grammar quizzes do not need to be graded by teachers. So this is your very traditional grammar in context quiz. They're supposed to fill in the correct form of the verb aller, the one we looked at earlier in that film. So they fill it in. They do it on a Monday. I didn't have to warn them. I can treat it like a pop quiz because when they're all finished, I'm going to put up the answers. They're going to grade their own paper, and then I'm going to ask them to make note of what they still need to study. Because these quizzes should be assisting them in getting ready for our performance assessments. So they can work on these skills, but these skills cannot be a significant part of the grade. I just recommend either don't count them at all or keep them down at 10%, but then give a similar quiz 4 or 5 days later and do the same thing. Let them grade it again. Are they getting better? If it's a vocabulary quiz, it's the same thing. List as many ways of going to school as you can today. Let's work on all this some more. Do it again later. Do you have more words? Do you learning? Good. Putting the responsibility on the learner for this type of information that is never going to be asked for in the real world. No one will ever hand a student a piece of paper and say fill in the blanks in the real world. So why would we as teachers invest so much time and energy into preparing and grading something that they will never be responsible for in the real world? And I think that's really the message with grammar. If we can make sure that the activities we do come as close as possible to the way we use language in the real world, then I think we've done what we need to do in terms of settling this issue of a paradigm of this way or this way, but rather it's a hybrid way that focuses on real world use. So this should be our mission. This is it. It's the first day of school. Put on the boiled eggs, shine your shoes, make your lunch, conjugate your verbs. Conjugate your verbs? Maybe we need to take the language that is never heard in the real world out of our language. And we need to make it come alive in the way that they will use it. So that kind of concludes my part. A couple minutes early, so we'll have a little longer for discussion. That's because Leah let me start a little early. So Leah, do I send this back to you now?
That would be great. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That you gave us so many great thoughts. I've been jotting down notes here, and I'm going to unmute everyone right now, so that if there are questions that you'd like to address before, show my screen, here we go. If there are questions that you'd like to address before we get into the reflecting portion, everyone is now unmuted. So if you have noise and background in your area, then maybe you could just mute yourself. But everybody should be unmuted at this point. Yep, I see that you are unmuted. And so if you have questions that you'd like to share before going into the reflection portion of our agenda, this is really a great time to do so.
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
This is Stephanie. So I love what you said about doing fill-ins and getting them to communication. And I had written about translation, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because some teachers want to still do the translation, and that feels like an extra step to getting to communication. I'm just curious what your thoughts are with that.
Well, I always tell teachers that translation is an absolute no-no.
Okay, good.
And the answer I use, though, is that the real world. They're never going to be asked to translate anything. It's always language to language. And then even if a teacher comes back and says, well, yes, but maybe there'll be an interpreter, there's a need for interpreters, I think we have to remind them that in order to be an interpreter, they have to get to the superior level of language. And it's hard to see a level 1 or 2 student as a superior. So I just don't see any value in it. It causes first language interference in major ways. It's why so many Spanish students continue to say me llamo es, even though their teachers have tried so hard to get it out. That's just that language interference that comes through translation.
Thank you. I agree with you, but I love your response. Thanks.
It's ACTFL's response, too, so you can
all...
Do we have other questions before we go into the reflection portion?
Could I say one more thing about translation, though?
Sure.
Sometimes we send mixed messages because when we work in the interpretive mode, we will translate or ask them to translate a reading. So once you ban translation, you ban translation from every mode of communication. Otherwise, it's an inconsistent message.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Go ahead.
Can
I ask a question about that then? So if you look at the IPAs, the tasks in the book by Actful, students are asked to answer the questions in English for the interpretive task because we don't want to confuse the production with a recognition, but that's still okay. That's not translation. It's
No, that's not
completing
there's not a
tasks.
single task on that comprehension guide that's a translation task. And the reason you do English there is because of the ease with which level 1 students can do the hunt and peck method of reading, because they don't know more than one way to say a word. It's a pure check of reading. So it's a completely different thing. It's another core practice. It's coming up, right, Leah?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right. Any other questions before we start typing? I'm just going to draw your attention to the agenda quickly, in that we're trying to come up with a protocol that really allows us to have leadership through active learning. This is unlike other webinars in that there's a certain degree of work that you do prior to the virtual meeting. Then we have time to work with our expert, and now this is our time to reflect on questions or topics that we'd like to further study or argue about or apply. So if we could just take a moment, we're going to take a few minutes here to add to these questions. You can see on my screen here that that there are several questions and ideas that have already been recorded. You can either share your own or you can stop and reply to someone else. There are, I think, 15 lines that have already been added here. And this will really help us to solidify our learning so that we can actually go and apply this moving forward in the weeks and the months that come. So we'll take about 6 or 7 minutes now, and so it will go kind of quiet and allow people to just type, and feel free to jump into the chat too if you have any trouble getting onto the agenda, and then we'll close up with Laura. But for those of you interested, Laura will be coming to Connecticut on June 23rd and 24th, and we're going to be specifically looking at integrating the 6 core practices into your IPA. So this obviously is open to folks from other states, and you can go onto the CT Colt website in order to register. So so that'll be an exciting time for us to be able to continue this conversation. So without any further ado, let's just take a look at that agenda. And if you have any trouble, please feel free to type into that chat box, and I'll make sure I send you the link or whatever you need. Okay, so we're at 4:15 now, and this is the time when we'll get a chance to let everybody kind of chime in and either ask a question or share something that you'd like to apply, argue about something, or simply agree with something that Laura has shared with us. So would somebody like to start off?
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead. Yes.
Um, so, we're getting students ready for these performance assessments that we're giving, or higher level, maybe you'd call it proficiency, but we have to give them formative assessments to get them there. So we're talking about fill-ins and other things. Are there other suggestions rather than doing that, or different ways to do smaller pieces before they get to those performance assessments that are better ways of checking for understanding? Because we all know we have to put a grade in the grading
Sure,
portal.
and everybody's in a different grading mindset on that. But for example, if you go back to the one that was the PACE model where it was working on things you did, a fair formative assessment would be to show an image that relates to the context you've been studying, ask them to pretend they're part of that image and say things that they did. The formative has to still be whole language without reminding them to use the preterite. Because as soon as you do the reminder, you're not in a real world context. So think of it as less of what you hope they'll be able to do by the end of the unit in the summative.
So can I just piggyback on Stephanie's question then? I guess as I find myself revising common summative assessments, whether they're, end of chapter or end of semester, um, we're really trying to shift as a full department. So what do those common summative chapter assessments look like? Are they more in the vein of an IPA, or in a vein of the picture that you showed us of Puerto Rico, where you have them narrating in past, present, and future times, where it's much more open-ended?
Well, I think it's either or. It depends on what you were really focusing on in that unit. If that unit's key function was to tell and retell stories, then it might be image-based with a before, during, and after mindset. But if not, I think that it is like an IPA, but the difference is that often an IPA culminates in a project, and we don't really control a project. We don't know what a student is doing on their own and what they're doing with support. So that's where I advocate for a presentational on-demand writing, which is really, let's face it, the way we check for grammar most of the time. So we just skip over what used to be on the old chapter test, which was a lot of fill-ins, and instead you ask them to talk about what they've learned in that chapter. So it's an IPA. What was the reading about? Now, what is your opinion about it? And now you're writing using the grammar. If it is really description, it could be a picture, described as picture. It just depends on what the function is. Right. But it has to be sentence level production at every level, because if we've spent 6 weeks on a unit, we're past words. We're into memorized sentences. So it's just really, what was the function? What are you hoping that they will be able to do?
That's a great answer. Did anybody else want to jump in with either an application, an ask, agree, or apply? I see Arlene is asking a question about what kind of rubrics do you suggest to use? And Laura, you wrote back that it's in the keys.
So that was, no. Somebody asked if I would share the honeycomb, and I will. You can email me and I'll put it up. There's a version in keys if you have the book in the appendix, but Donna and I created a new version, so if anybody emails me, I can send it. Or Leah, if I can send it to you and you can
Perfect.
post it, that'd be good. For it depends what kind of rubrics you use. It depends on your purpose. If your purpose is to give feedback on how they did on a particular unit or task, then I think you need a performance rubric using the ACTFL domains like fluency and comprehension and comprehensibility and those types of things, cultural awareness. If you're looking for an end of semester or end of year, open-ended IPA type assessment, and you want to get a sense of proficiency, then I think you look at the IPA manual and you use the proficiency rubrics. But you can't use proficiency rubrics for every unit, because when we're in a unit, we're like the coach who's got 9 games in the season, and the type of feedback we give needs to be discrete. So it's how do you get better in vocabulary. If we use a proficiency rubric, we know they're not really going to get better because it's a measure of time. So we're consistently going to report to them that you met expectations, you're a novice high, novice high, novice high. And we can give them the feedback for how to get to intermediate low, but it's like moving from JV to varsity. Right. It's nice feedback, but it's going to take a little while longer than 1 more unit. So it depends on the situation.
Yeah. I also very much like, somebody commented on how they really liked your idea of giving the quiz on the first day and then 48 hours later. I think that would be a great conversation starter for PLCs, because for the folks who are so committed to their linear approach to grammar, even if you share the article about how it's more like a garden growing, I think there's only so far you can go with theory, and I think that would really help bring home the idea of that they need to just keep working at it over a long period of time, and maybe the teachers will walk away with that realization.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so we talked about the AP exam and the new one. I'm really familiar with it, and our students tend to do better on the speaking and the writing, but they really struggle with the reading and the listening because it's multiple choice. And once again, in real life, we go back to that. Are there some strategies and ways, because we can't just all of a sudden pop it on them senior year if they haven't been doing it. So what can we do about that situation to help them?
Well, I do think that if you have teachers at the lower levels that are embedding a lot of interpretive text, that's step number 1. Because if you happen to still be in textbooks and you think about where reading occurs, it occurs at the end of the unit or the back of the book, and often it gets skipped for a time crunch. So I do think that part of the problem in interpretive has to do with neglecting the mode in our lower levels. So it's sort of like saying, hey, don't bother reading in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. Let's do chapter books when we get to 4th grade. And I think we still have some of that going on in our curriculum. But also the IPA comprehension guide, although it's not multiple choice, can be easily adapted to multiple choice. I would not adapt it in levels 1 and 2. But I would certainly start adapting it and target language to target language by the time you're 4 or 5, so that they're taking tests that look like what they're going to take. And the other issue for listening is we don't start them at lower levels listening to all the different accents. So they often just hear the teacher's voice and they become very comfortable with that particular accent. We've got to reach out to some of the audio files and things that are online with speakers from around the world.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great point. We would never think of skipping the interpretive mode in the native language. It's odd that I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right that we often push that to the end of entire units.
And we do worse than that. We deny them text because they won't understand something. So I know I spent many years in level 1 saying, if it's written in the past, I won't use it. I never denied my son a book about dinosaurs when he was 4 years old because it was written in the past tense. So we have to just let him use that interpretive text and help them to understand as much as they can without expecting them to understand every word, because as a non-native speaker of French who tries to read French today, I don't understand every word, ever.
That's a great point. I think we should probably be ending on that point. But if there's anybody who wants to
I
jump
just want
in,
to come back to one last question. Did
Yes.
anybody think of a function that requires a direct object pronoun?
I did not.
I bet no one did. No one ever has. So if you think of one, be sure to email it to me. The definition of a pronoun is that it replaces a noun. So it's never incorrect to use the noun. So it's nearly impossible to require them in real world speech.
Yeah, this is going to be a good debate at RPLC tomorrow, as we're in the midst of direct and indirect objects in a couple classes right now. So I'm sure we'll have some good conversations around our table.
Well, have fun. Thanks for letting me do this, guys. This is a great topic.
Well,
Wish we were all together so we could debate it further.
I thank you from all of us because some people are muted, and just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to come to us, whether you're coming, Lucas, from Ohio, we have some great hotels up in Glastonbury, or if you're coming from Rhode Island or Massachusetts, consider joining us on June 22nd and 23rd. And actually having 2 days to work with Laura so we can really get into the thick of this. And so there are people typing into the chat
I'm just
thanking you.
responding to the 6C.
I like the 6C.
I don't think we can make the 6C. I was not serious. It would be detrimental to the profession. It really would. But
Well, it's an interesting one, so that's good. Well, I will follow up with an email once my husband renders the video. I will have the attached files. And also, Laura had two really good articles about teaching grammar, one from the Language Educator that I will send in. So if you'd like to continue reading about this, that would be great. And from the bottom of our hearts, Laura, thank you very much.
oh, thank you. Thanks, Leah, for doing this.
Great to see all of you. And anybody who missed it, just let them know that they can go in and still keep adding to the agenda and everything here. So, and we'll see you next month. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, Laura.